Not surprisingly, Paul appears to have crafted his personal letters to the various congregations with which he worked using the accepted conventions of his day. We do too. There is a reason you start your letters, Dear So and so, and end with Yours truly. You do that because contemporary conventions and expectations of letter writing demand it. That's how I know I'm reading a letter and not a story, because it begins, Dear So and so, and not, It was a dark and stormy night. Moreover, and especially with letters, the form of the letter usually reflects its purpose. If you get a letter that begins, My darling dearest, you have one set of expectations for the letter. But if it begins, Dear occupant, you have a very different set of expectations. So it was in Paul's day. If you were writing a persuasive piece to the congregation, as Paul typically does, the congregation would have certain expectations about how that letter would proceed. Paul knew that and consequently crafted his letters accordingly. Travel in the ancient world was difficult, time-consuming, costly, and even dangerous. It simply was not possible for Paul to be physically present with the congregations he'd established and with which he had engaged in an ongoing ministry. Moreover, Paul appeared to have a mission strategy that necessitated his moving from place to place with some frequency. That strategy involved gathering an offering from the Gentile churches he had established in order to support their Jewish brothers and sisters in the mother church in Jerusalem, a congregation that had fallen on hard times due to an untimely famine. It also involved his desire to carry the gospel to Rome and Spain, to the westernmost fringes of the empire. Paul addresses both of these concerns in Romans chapter 15. There is also the possibility that Paul's itinerant ministry style was, at least in part, a function of his imminent eschatology, specifically his belief that the parousia, the Greek word for return of Jesus, might happen at any moment and therefore necessitated his staying on the move, as it were, to establish as many congregations as possible in advance of that event. Moreover, Paul's letter writing served to provide a presence in the absence, as it were, with the congregations with which he carried on his correspondence. That is to say, his letters did not just provide the congregations with information, they also provided them with a proxy presence, a presence in papyrus rather than person, as it were. Even today, while telephone calls and emails are nice, there is no substitute for a physical letter from someone. It becomes a tangible, tactile token of their presence. Moreover, Paul's letters were corporate and congregational for the most part, intended to be read when the community gathered to worship. It doesn't take much imagination to picture the excitement and sometimes consternation when the worship leader rose, scroll in hand, and announced, We've gotten a letter from Paul. Paul often wrote letters in response to specific situations or occasions. They were not intended to be off-the-cuff ruminations. Most often his letters addressed a specific situation or situations in the congregation which, had he been physically present, he would have handled in person. Now, Paul was no armchair theologian wearing a jacket with patches on the sleeves and expounding on the ultimate mysteries of the universe from the security of an endowed university chair. The congregations with whom Paul carried on correspondence were located in the diaspora, without the advantages their sister congregations enjoyed back in Palestine. Advantages such as a common scripture and tradition, Torah and temple. Out where Paul had to do his theology, there were no mothers or fathers in the faith to give clarity and stability, no long history or tradition to guide the church through difficult problems. The churches Paul established on pagan soil had experiences for which there were no texts and problems for which there were no precedents. And so when problems arose, They wrote to the only authority they knew, the missionary who had started the church. Paul's theologizing then was forged in the heat of congregational conflict. Consequently, his theologizing was specific, particular, and indigenous to the congregation for which it was intended. It is for that reason that systematic theologians sometimes accuse Paul of inconsistencies at best, outright contradictions at worst. But Paul, on the other hand, was a pastoral theologian, more concerned with congregational health than he was with theological consistency. Paul wrote his missives on papyrus, an ancient writing material made from the pith of the papyrus plant, indigenous to the Nile River valley of Egypt. The bark of the reed was stripped off, revealing the pith, which was then crisscrossed into a rudimentary paper. Indeed, our English word paper derives from the Greek word papyrus. The papyrus was then pressed and dried and finally used as a writing material. It was much cheaper than the more expensive alternative, leather from the skins of animals, which was then sewn together to form a parchment. The papyrus Paul used was about 9.5 inches by 11 inches, roughly the size of today's sheets of paper. The individual papyrus sheets were then sewn together to form a scroll. Paul frequently used a secretary known as an amanuensis to do the actual writing, with Paul putting his John Hancock, as it were, at the end of the letter to vouchsafe its authenticity. Paul's letters followed the form and style of the day. First was the address, generally Paul to X. In this way, both the letter's author and recipients were immediately identified. Now, this makes much better sense if you think about it than the way we do it today, having to read all the way to the end of the letter to find out who the letter is from. This was most often followed by a thanksgiving from the recipients, the gospel, Paul's calling and or ministry, and so forth. Oftentimes, Paul will hint in the thanksgiving some, if not all, of the issues he intends to address in the letter. This was not only good piety, it was good strategy, if you think about it, talking to God about the issues you are having with the congregation in the congregation's own hearing. The body of the letter is where Paul identified the problem and brought the appropriate scriptural exegesis and theology to bear upon it. This was typically followed by an exhortation in which Paul addresses the so what question, encouraging the congregation to take appropriate action to address the problem or issue. Finally, Paul concludes his letters with a prayer for the congregation, personal greetings to persons in the congregation with whom he is personally familiar, and a benediction or blessing. Because Paul's letters are specific to the congregation he addresses and occasional to the purpose which precipitated them, attempts to identify a typical or standard structure of Paul's argument in his letters lacks consensus. That said, Paul does appear in his letters to make use of the standard style of argumentation of his day, namely Greek rhetoric. Paul's culture and context were steeped in Greek thought and expression. When it comes to the forms and conventions of argumentation, the Greeks, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, articulated patterns and conventions of persuasive speaking and argumentation, which they called rhetoric. Paul appears not only to have a knowledge of these patterns and conventions, but to have made use of them in his letter writing. Aristotle identified 3 different types of rhetoric, depending on their context and purpose. First was forensic rhetoric, legal rhetoric in which the speaker or writer either accuses or defends. Next comes deliberative rhetoric, legislative rhetoric in which the speaker or writer attempts to persuade the audience of something. And finally, epideictic rhetoric, public rhetoric in which the speaker or writer engages in either praise or blame in terms of continuity or discontinuity with communal standards. Each of these styles is detectable in Paul's letters, though there is no consensus as to which rhetorical style he appears to use at any given time. Paul, it seems, will combine elements of different rhetorical styles in the same letter if it suits his purposes to do so.